Welcome, everybody. We have a great turnout this afternoon. I'm so thrilled, and as people have emailed me as we started to announce this event on Ecopoetry today, I realized how much it resonates with all of us as we look at, those of us who are all of us here today that care about the earth and see the changes that are accelerating in our lifetime. Melting ice sheets, fires, droughts, climate injustice, climate migration. And also, all of our poets today come from Maine. And I think those of us who live in Maine feel we live here because we have a special connection to nature and the earth, and that we get fed physically and spiritually because of that through where we live. So I want to thank you all for being a part of this event. When I thought about having it, I reached out to my friend, the photographer, visual artist, and poet, John Paul Caponigro, and asked if he would do this with me. As both a co-host and a poet and a reader. And fortunately, he agreed. And then we added Maine poets who we thought would add to our perspective about the environment, the earth, eco-poetry. So as many of you know, the Poets Corner was founded by myself and Catherine Seitz, who is here today, if she waves her hand perhaps, to create and expand community around poetry and short prose. We're both writers. We both felt it was in June of 2020. We're sheltering in. We wanted to write, but we wanted to connect with other people. So we started then. Today we have over 2,000 people that are part of that community, and we're grateful to all of you. We are recording today's event, so please turn off your video if you don't want to appear. And before we begin, I want to tell you about a couple of upcoming events. On April 20th, which is Wednesday at 7 p.m., we are hosting Naomi Shihab Nye in a special celebration of National Poetry Month in collaboration with Mercy by the Sea. And you can register, you can find out more on our websites, thepoetscorner.org, or register on mercybythesea.org on their website. The registration is $35 for this event, but scholarships are available if that's, if that's something you'd like, you just ask for that. And then on Sunday, May 1st, we are hosting the 3 poets who will be teaching at Maine Media for the Writers Harbor Poetry Week, which is a very special week where the 3 different poets teach their own workshops. They all teach craft seminars that everybody gets to attend, and there are readings all week. And so we will be introducing them to you. They are Richard Blanco, Carrie Fountain, and Rajiv Mohabir. And at the same time, they'll be reading, they'll be talking about their work, maybe a little bit about their workshops that are coming up. But on that event, we plan to announce the winner of the 2022 chapbook contest that we did in collaboration with Maine Media Workshops in college. So we hope you'll return to learn who the winner is, and then the winner will have their own reading. The juror for that contest was Naomi Shihab Nye. And so she will be hosting the event on June 12th, which will feature the winner of the chapbook contest. So welcome to all of you. At this point, I want to turn it over to John Paul, whose work as a visual artist and whose voice as a poet always inspires me to look at the world through new eyes. So thank you, John Paul.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you. Thank you to my fellow poets for joining us today, and thank you all for being here to celebrate poetry in the environment or nature. As Meg said, the multi-generational group of poets joining us for this event are all living in Maine and have a deep connection to nature. Poetry about nature is about as old as poetry, but as humanity's relationship with nature has changed, never more so than in the last century, a new term has arisen: ecopoetry. When I asked each of our participants to say what ecopoetry was to them, an interesting debate started, which will resurrect and continue during our Q&A session. It promises to be lively. So rather than starting this session by telling, we'll show and then talk about it afterwards, first together and then with you. I've asked each reader to lead with one poem by another poet that inspires them, and followed by reading their poetry. In addition, each poet has recommended a book also related to the theme, and that list of books is posted on this event's webpage on the Poets Corner. Support your local bookstore. I discovered the book I recommended, a new favorite, The Wilds of Poetry, at Gary Lawless's Gulf of Maine Books, a standard in Brunswick since 1979. If you reach out to him, I'm certain he'd be delighted to recommend many more books. It's a passion he shared for so many years with so many. So, back to you, Meg.
I get to unmute, first of all. I get to introduce our first reader, who will be Gary Lawless. And many of us know him as the co-owner of Gulf of Maine Books in Brunswick, or the editor and publisher of Blackberry Books. I had the privilege of hearing him read from his latest book, How the Stones Came to Venice, from Literal Books. And his poetry is inspiring and wonderful. And, I know some of his history because I've taken a workshop with Gary, and he's talked about his history with Gary Snyder and some of the beat poets, and, just a long life in poetry. And I am so pleased that he's agreed to share his work and some of his thoughts with us today. So please join me in welcoming Gary Lawless.
Thanks, Meg. Thanks, JP. It's fun to be here in an alternate universe with you. There I am. So my first poem is a poem by my mentor, Nanao Sakaki, who was a wandering Japanese poet, and I wandered with him around the planet. And I edited his collected poems and published them, and this is the first poem in the book. If you have time to chatter, read books. If you have time to read, walk into mountain, desert, ocean. If you have time to walk, sing songs and dance. If you have time to dance, sit quietly, you happy, lucky idiot. So I'm representing the happy, lucky idiot school of poetics here today, which is where I've belonged for a long time. This is a little poem that comes from being enthralled with the now. When the animals come to us asking for our help, will we know what they are saying? When the plants speak to us in their delicate, beautiful language, will we be able to answer them? When the planet herself sings to us in our dreams, will we be able to wake ourselves and act? And this is a poem I spent the summer of 1980 on the south shore of Labrador, hanging out with icebergs and fish and lots of things. So this is one day I was down by the beach, and there was a male humpback whale washed up on the beach and dying on the beach. And this, we don't know as humans what to do with the deaths of each other. And then deaths of other species are really, beyond our capacity to react. And sometimes, so What do poets do? You write a poem. Here's a poem for that whale. You are the last whale washed up on a far beach. The waves are pushing against you, pushing against you. Your brothers and sisters are gone. The light is too bright for your eyes. You cannot breathe. Small children are laughing, throwing rocks and climbing onto your body. You die alone, your ears full of wind. You are the last buffalo. The sun is setting over the plains. You stand alone, enormous, heavy with fur, lonely. You are tired of running. Tired of running. All of your friends have gone. It seems even the earth has turned against you. There is no one to say goodbye. You rest, listening to the wind. When the time is right, the spirit of the wolf returns. And here's, we're representing many generations now. I'm representing the old folks generation here. But in thinking about time, my lifetime is such a tiny speck in terms of time of the life of the universe. You know, from the Big Bang to now, my life is a really tiny speck. So this is, I live here on Damascotta Lake in a house that was owned by writers Henry Weston and Elizabeth Coatsworth, and then their daughter, Kate Barnes. So I'm sitting in a parlor where Elizabeth Coatsworth spent a lot of time thinking about the lake, about Damascotta Lake. Damascotta Lake. Do the loons tell their children stories of this lake? Do the stones remember the glacier? In the clay, clamshells from 10,000 years ago, do they still dream of the ocean? Do we remember the time before there were stars, before there was light? So I will pass this on to our next reader.
Thank you so much, Gary. Those are beautiful poems and very moving. And John Paul, I think I don't see Kathleen here yet, so I think I'll move to you next. That's great. I introduced John Paul a little bit when I first turned it over to him, but I do want to say that he's an internationally collected visual artist, a published author, and leads incredible adventures into the wildest places on earth to help people connect in a deeper way with nature and themselves. He's been featured on TEDx, and his TEDx and Google talks are on his website, johnpaulcaponigro.com. And over the 20 plus years that I've known JP, I find his art and his voice inspiring to me in so many ways. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you again, Meg. Thank you. You can find a little bit more about my poetry story on my website. I'm just going to jump right in, save for that. I'm coming at this initially as a visual artist, somebody who has had a lifelong practice of writing poetry, particularly haiku, because it's portable and easy and quick. I love short forms, but the great pause gave me the gift of poetry for really digging back into something that I studied in college, but didn't practice as deeply as I'd always wanted to. So it's come to an interesting point in my thinking, feeling, career, that words and pictures are deeply interrelated, and that sometimes pictures are not enough. You know, as a visual artist, I've turned to poetry because language is part of the problem and the solution. And this poem explores that. Labyrinth of language. First, there was breath, all groan, moan, gasp murmurs, and grunt, growl whispers, gestures, dilating and contracting. Then came the engorging howl, sighing in improvisational elation grief. Each breath was one more wind of our world. We were in us. Second, Same sounds bound one meaning between many minds. Ideas flourished in chains of vocal delights. Stories told were retold with something always renewed. Never same there, always here, now. Collective memory unfolded and refolded, unsame truths. Third, handmade images signifying sounds, soft, simplified semblances, pictures, graphing ciphers, N, re, D, code, mode, a thing, but not the thing itself, so delayed the ligaments of thought unloosened. Linearity created hierarchies. Primacy was fixed. Then, no longer now, relocated outside the body. Unmetamorphosis, reperformed, uncyclically incessant. Fourth, in the beginning was the word, came after the word, worded world with the deepest abstract sever, imageless representations offering scant traces of onomatopoeia and echoes in some shells. Literacy seized power over, putting some under, the biggest wound, othering others. Stop. Recounting language is the problem and the solution. I will have my way with it, or it will have its way with me. Use it or be used. Exhaust language until I submit to a prime silence and find sanctuary in our world's music. The next one is entitled The Department of the Interior, and the epigraph is drawn from the government website. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, also known as Indian Affairs, is a United States federal agency within the Department of the Interior. If managing land was managing people, if managing people was managing land, if one was seen as the other and the other as one, our bodies in our land, and our land is in our bodies. This one's called Roots. One root dug through dirt and curled around a stone. One root tapped a vein of water and carried an invisible river into the sky. One root crawled curvy distances, never truly departing or finally arriving, but always never returning. Some roots dove deep. Some roots walked wide, and wild kept growing wilder. A curious community of leaves mushroomed madly. The sum of their roots swelled fuller, faster than their branches. They held the soil, they held the water, they held the garden, and kept them from washing away. Yet, the better part of the forest was never seen. We should have thought twice before we cut the trees. We only saw half of them, at best. Gone are the overstory and the understory, and all the other stories within them. I think one of the many things that characterize eco-poetry, and it is an impending sense of doom, the apocalypse is no longer humanity at the mercy of a larger nature, but nature at the mercy of us. And this poem leans into that. Unwound. The epigraph is from John Muir. When one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world. Somebody pulled the threads between the trees, and now we see our fecund forests unraveling, fibers coming down unwound to the ground. 3 trunks, 2 saplings, 1 sprout. No more seeds, no more buds, no more leaves. No longer sheltered, the water runs away. Something untwirled the waters, and now we see our roaring rivers retreating ragged in strands, cords thicker becoming thinner before unbecoming. 10 tributaries, 100 trickles, 1,000 springs, desiccated. Winding traces and dust blowing back into the sky. Sometime the skies began unlacing, and now we see our colors faded, fibers frayed, rainbows unknit. Azure dies to grease, decays to muck. Stars are pulling out, one by one. In some places there are none, no warp, no weft. Millions of suns, billions of constellations, trillions of galaxies gone from too much artificial light. Night burns brighter and days smolder darker. Someplace wild has torn apart inside us. And now we are monstrous unweavers, untangling ourselves, collapsing the web, unstitching the fabric, fraying into small balls of string, finite loops, unsutured severs. Soon, we will cut the great knot. The pattern will be lost, and we won't know how to retie it. Don't come undone. Twist and spin. Sew yourself back in. This one is repossession. The cloud wants its rain, reclaims its gifts. The river subsides until it has no sides, its banks emptied dry. The soil buries its blessing, sows infertility, uncertainty. The tree asks for its leaves, puts forth no more roots, retracts its bud, no longer produces fruit. The fish flees for deeper water to too thin shoals of darker shadows. The animal runs, but finds no corner untouched. What cannot escape gives up its ghost, leaves a stain. The earth waits for us to lay our final ignominies in its geologic record before it restores its long cycle of gifts. This final poem is a piece of a longer sequence celebrating one of my favorite places, which is on a lot of people's mind these days, always on mine, Antarctica. Never ask me if I tire of it, returning for yet another season of summer ice with sunsets that last hours and even days when it doesn't. Still, if it does, it leaves an absence of true night, holding too few stars in unquenchable light before it rises. Abundance of whale songs will haunt my dreams if I dare shut my eyes, despite my fear of not remembering. Well, I'm all birds inside for it. Thank you, Meg.
Thank you. I love that fear of not remembering. That's wonderful poems, JP. And now we'll go to Kathleen Ellis. And Kathleen's most recent poetry collection, with two collections, are Outer Body Travel and Narrow River to the North. Her poems have appeared in the Cafe Review, A Dangerous New World, Maine Voices on the Climate Crisis, and Enough, Poems of Resistance and Protest. She's the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Maine Arts Commission. She teaches poetry and creative writing at the University of Maine, Orono, and coordinates the annual Poets Speak event in Bangor. She's also taught poetry writing workshops at the Farnsworth Art Museum since 1994. So please join me in welcoming Kathleen Ellis.
Thank you, Meg. And excuse me for having a difficult time in getting here. I couldn't get the link to work, but I fiddled and I finally got it. So I'm glad to be here. Gary Snyder defines poetry as song. And when he says that, he means song in a very large way with a very specific meaning, connoting the archaic origin of poetry. You always feel when he reads that he's coming from somewhere way, way, way behind him. But I'm going to start with a love letter to the earth. The honeymoon's over, and there won't be any more skipped heartbeats or a fluttery stomach mistaken for love. So how to explain those lovebirds in the photo with the ocean behind them offering infinity, or at least the idea of ebb and flow? There was a time when even a glimpse of your blue aura was a reward. On your behalf, I am now bereft. Because of you, it hurts me to remember the tickling presence of a spiny seahorse cupped in my hand, endangered now, stripped from the seabed, bycatch, dried and sold for Chinese medicine and trinkets. Because of you, I am deprived of you. Now, even peeling an orange reminds me of the planet in all its pithiness between fruit and rind. Only a faint aroma remains. Scientists say when we age, our sense of smell is the first to go. I loved your conifer forests for the sharp scent of their resin. On your behalf, I am mourning the disappearance of honeybees. The honeymoon's over, and we who survived the upheavals of the earth, how could we have betrayed those flutterings, this shiver of love? The next one is called Ghost Trees. And maybe some of you are familiar with that expression. And ghost trees are all the way up and down the eastern seaboard now. And they have to do with too much salinity in the estuaries. And as the water becomes more saline, the trees have a hard time living and getting nutrients, and they eventually die. But they're called ghost trees because they remain standing. Ghost trees. From where I stand, the sheer drop to the river is over 80 feet. An overgrown trail, swampy in places, the distance between us. The old growth forest of hemlock and pine is another time. Virgin, they say, never been logged and standing firm. Their aura is green, but their skin is rough and fibrous. I breathe in the earthy smell of the natural world, dripping wet, embracing itself. What would it be if the river were tidal? Salt water intrusion. Little by little, the ocean is rising, pushing salt water inland. One day, you will be the skeletons of yourselves, gray and dead, but left standing. I am alarmed by your inability to resist. I think of the ghost forests expanding northward, erasing habitat. Words, the salt in the sea, my skin, your skin, windows of memory. From where I stand, I remember who you are. I remember what you will become. So many of the poems that many poets are writing these days are elegies, sense of great loss. And so I've been looking for some poems I have that are not as sad. And maybe this one is, maybe it's not. It's called The Great Redundancy. The water is rising everywhere, warming seas, melting glaciers, and ice sheets with nowhere to go but into estuaries and tidal rivers. It's only a matter of time, before ancient maps of the world featuring sea monsters are selling out in the checkout lane. Everyone knows we're next in the lineup of likely suspects. Who said what and when and where do we go from here? And whether there's nowhere else to go but underwater, which can also be said of the great white sharks, long considered the most bloodthirsty carnivores on Earth, now fleeing like lily livers whenever the killer whales show up at their feeding grounds. And even then, they do not all escape alive. The feeding frenzy of the killer whales does not escape us. We are multiplying the monsters we can see and fear. We are building our house on higher ground. We are watching the news that tells us who is at the top of the food chain. Not the orca, not even us, but these rising seas, eschewing the monsters we can see and fear. It's only a matter of time. Whole families watching the shore slip out from under them. Well, that was even sadder. And just a couple more. I'm working on a series called Words for Water. This morning when I was driving back from somewhere, I was going by the Stillwater River, which is a tributary of the Penobscot, and it separates Orono from the island on which the university is. And there's a big parking lot, which is called the steam plant parking lot, and it was packed with cars. And the water on the river is very high right now because of the rains and the snow melt. And it's about to go over the edge of the parking lot, which it does every couple of years. Every once in a while, a car goes in, it's floating out there on the river. But it reminds me now, when I see that coming, thinking of sea level rise in general. Words for water, thinking of the people in Eastern Ukraine who have suffered for 7 years of conflict with Russia and struggled for lack of access to clean drinking water. Number 1, a word on a page is not wet. A word cannot contain itself, spilling over its banks. I was astounded when I heard all the words for water: liquid, fluid, rain, agua, aqua, apa, Adam's ale, Wasser, tears, saliva, H2O, tap water, groundwater, bath water, salt water, wastewater, carbonated, chlorinated, contaminated, filtered, muddy, purified, polluted, sulfurous, treated, drip, drop, droplet, crashing, cresting, damned, holy, pure, impure, perilous. My first thought was water, yours too, and yours, all of us drinking in the wetness of our births. One more to read you. It's part of this series.
Kathleen,
Yeah,
just sorry to interrupt, but we can hear some of the rustling papers. If
Oh.
you could just be a little aware,
sorry.
it'd be
Sorry.
great. Thanks.
Okay. And so this one has to do with the island of Alameda, which is in the San Francisco Bay. And I was born on that island and grew up there until I was 10. And it's now sinking into the San Francisco Bay. Alameda, I've just heard you are sinking into the bay, which is no surprise since you rose from the reeds where I learned to swim at Cottage Baths, a remnant of Neptune Beach before I was treading water in the womb. Loving you, I have been loved by water, the word being an island with its edges surrounded by rising seas. Alameda becomes, alas, alarming, a la mode, my Alamo, the watery mass of debris spilling from the riprap. An island is like a river weighing its options. And now recalling the line of us tossing sandbags throughout the night, aside the levees of the Sacramento, the uncertainty, not to mention the flooding of emotion. I think that my time is up. Thank you.
Kathleen, those were wonderful poems. And I'd seen ghost trees. I'd never heard the term before. Now they'll haunt me.
Ghosts.
That's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Our next poet is Meghan Sterling. And Meghan is, let me just pull this up for a minute because I don't want to miss a piece of this. Meghan's work has been nominated for 4 Pushcart Prizes in 2021. And I'm not surprised. Her poetry is wonderful. It's been published or is forthcoming in Rattle, Colorado Review, Idaho Review, the Pinch Journal, Radar Poetry, Pacifica Literary Review, and Valparaiso Poetry Review, among many others. She's the associate poetry editor of the Maine Review and the winner of Sweet Literary's 2021 Poetry Contest, Equinox's 2021 Poetry Contest, and West Trestle Review's 2021 Poetry Contest. Her debut full-length collection, called These Few Seeds from Terrapin Books, also came out in 2021. What a year. And her forthcoming chapbook, Self-Portrait with Ghosts of the Diaspora, from Harbor Editions, will be out in April of 2023. You can read her book on her website at meghansterling.com. And we're so glad she's part of this reading today. Please join me in welcoming Meghan.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Yes, 2021 was the year I decided to truly come out of the closet as a poet and submit it everywhere. So good things happen if you submit large amounts of things. So here's my book, These Few Seeds. This is my first full-length collection. I'm a parent of a small child. And as a parent of a small child, I'm looking at everything and doing everything through this filter of her experience, both present and future. And that has been, for me, the lens in truly accelerating my alarm about the state of our climate. Everything is about, is this her last snowfall? Is this her last winter? Is this, what is she going to experience in her life, and worrying. And I write poetry as a way of dealing with so much of that worry. And this book is really a lot about that. I wrote this book starting when she was 9 months old, and wrote the pieces in it until she was about, let's say, like 2.5. So I'm going to start with the first poem in the book. It's called Morning Prayer. And here we go. Morning Prayer. It is the beginning. It is the beginning when there was you. It is the beginning when there was you and me and her, before it all just became life, when it was new. Can you remember? We are there now again, standing at the beginning where we can hold the new of her, the new of who we have just become, our new names, mother, father, taking these names from our ancestors, all the others who were what we are now, taking these names out of the air before we have a chance to try them on, our new names, standing at the edge of water, praying for our daughter's safety. It is the beginning when there was you and me and her in the water that's rising, oceans, lakes, rivers, streams, all rising on this morning, still soft with the night that was just here. So, where beauty and grief and fear all mingle, right? That's something I'm always trying to understand and trying to write myself through. So this poem is called California. California is always coming apart somewhere, a fire or a fault in the earth opening itself in love, in ruin, which is to say, utterly. This place. Eucalyptus in wide stands, filtering light and exhaust, leaves like wings, the ocean eating the side of the whole state like it can't get enough of those shore pines, shards of cliff jutting out into the Pacific. After all, California is a poem, Steinbeck said, and like many things he knew, he saw the truth. This place can break you. Cherry flames ripping up the sides of whole mountains, redwood forests ringed in mist. And then we go on. So this one is just called Daughter. I adore my daughter. I love her so much. I've never loved like it. There's nothing like it, at least in my experience. And I learn the news, I read the news, I get the New York Times and the headlines and the climate, we're heading for disaster. And all I care about is that I want her to be okay. And that's been this wonderful shift in my life where instead of, oh, me, am I going to be okay? Like, I don't care, like, whatever. Is she going to be okay? And so this poem is called Daughter. I dream that the earth is on fire beneath us. That is what love is. I take you into myself as though you are the petal, pink to the open hand, a plum stone sweet. And what was broken opens wide, all the things I never knew or felt in an explosion that feels like pain, but is fear and a terrible hunger to save all this for you to live in. An ocean that asks for tenderness, a sky that begs for quiet. The waves of your soft hair are all that stills the thrashing of a heart that's been submerged and drowned 1,000,000 times over. I need you to be safe, your face already a memory, as though the smoke from a burn pile has created its sepia tone. I remember when I was pregnant with her, she was in my belly, as I say to her. And the woods all around Asheville, I was living in Asheville, North Carolina, the woods all around Asheville were on fire. And I couldn't go outside on my daily pregnant lady walks, pregnant lady waddle. And it was sort of the start for me of this, of what am I stepping into? Parenting the small being and guiding the small being in this world that's crumbling. It's a scary path. This poem, Codicil. To you, my daughter, whose earth may not be my earth, whose earth may be scorched with flames, whose earth may be ripped apart by gunfire and blood, whose earth may wilt under the heat of a too near sun, whose earth may reveal her ocean beds to be desert skin, whose earth may be hardened with sand and rock, whose earth may wither dry as a peach stone, whose earth may be divided by walls and colors, whose earth may be sunk with pills and powders, whose earth may thunder with the rattling of trucks, whose earth may be sour with salt, whose earth may be drowned in melt. To you I bequeath all the courage of birds and flowers, water and stones, to love enough, to love with the toughness of trees. I'll read one last one and then I'll stop. I write a lot of poems about this. This one echoes a lot of what the other poets have been saying. Evening prayer. Maybe bees remain, pollinate orchards, ripe fruit for the birds that tend their young and thrive. Maybe forests bind their wounds, come back fuller and greener from the scorch, while an evening sky fills, dotted with seeds that land in city streets, replacing pavement with fields of wildflowers, volunteer greens for the rabbits, the deer, the groundhogs. Maybe the moon shifts and tides cover the earth, and coral and whales return, sharks and dolphins, jellyfish in their see-through pinks and electric yellows, now unfettered in their access to the blue globe. Maybe flowers rise, become big and bright and waxy, hot, wet pink and red folds and stamen, pistil and ovary. Maybe it all becomes still and quiet, the woods silent but for bird chatter, lakes and rivers as they rush over rocks, as springs feed them, while mice and chipmunks, sparrows and swallows, spiders and nearly clear bugs with delicate wings peek out from their meek shadows in safety when we have gone. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Megan, for sharing those poems with us. Wonderful treat. And our last poet and certainly not last but not least in any way, is Iris Elise L. And Iris is a second-year English major at the University of Maine, Orono. She's president of the Creative Writing Club, and she's been featured in the undergraduate literary magazine, The Open Field. She was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a Northern Kentucky farming family. And the cultural and geographic climate at this intersection of the Midwest, the South, and Appalachia has been a recurring theme in her creative and academic work. In 2019, she studied under poet Richie Hoffman during a Kenyon College summer residency program. And she's recently been the recipient of one of the Grenfell Prizes awarded by the UMaine English Department. When she isn't at the university, she works at Foreverland Farm in Amelia, Ohio, where she's been an animal sanctuary coordinator for 2 years. Please join me in welcoming Iris Elise L.
Hi, thank you. So for the poem that I'm going to start with, it isn't perhaps like a traditional eco poem because it has a very urban setting and it's very focused on like the human perspective. But it's one of my favorites, and I think it creates a really great space for imagining like the natural world on top of our built one. And I guess to mourn what's been lost to urbanization. I grew up in a city in the Midwest, so as a child, I spent a lot of time seeking out the natural within the built environment. And I think that that searching has lingered in my poetry and my taste in poetry. Like I can't like quite get the city all the way out. So this is Nikki Giovanni's Walking Down Park. Walking down Park, Amsterdam, or Columbus, do you ever stop to think what it looked like before it was an avenue? Did you ever stop to think what you walked before you rode subways to the stock exchange? We can't be on the stock exchange, we are the stock exchanged. Did you ever maybe wonder what grass was like before they rolled it into a ball and called it Central Park, where syphilitic dogs and their two-legged tubercular masters fertilized the corners and sidewalks? Ever want to know what would happen if your life could be fertilized by a love thought from a loved one who loves you? Ever look south on a clear day and not see Times Squares, but see tall birch trees with sycamores touching hands, and see gazelles running playfully after the lions? Ever hear the antelope bark from the third floor apartment? Did you ever sit down and wonder about what freedom's freedom would bring? It's so easy to be free. You start by loving yourself, then those who look like you, all else will come naturally. Ever wonder why so much asphalt was laid in so little space? Probably so we would forget the Iroquois, Algonquin, and Mohicans who could caress the earth. Ever think what Harlem would be like if our herbs and roots and elephant ears grew, sending a cacophony of sound to us? The parrot parroting, black is beautiful, owls sending out whoos, making love, and me and you just sitting in the sun, trying to find a way to get a banana tree from one of the monkeys, koala bears in the trees laughing at our listlessness. Ever think it's possible for us to be happy? And so then moving into my own poems, this one, I have a tendency to, when I go into the natural world, I think like as a lot of people do, to sort of expect answers about a lot of things. But this poem is about an experience that I had over the last summer. I was forced to take Latin in high school, so I think a lot about birds as sort of like fortune tellers, and this is sort of an example of how they aren't, they're just living their own lives. So this one is called Eroding. I saw a falcon once in the red hot heat of West Virginia July. Two swirling heads, two wavering hands, I felt melting into the hills, covered in cloud shadow, wandering dark, eyes round and waking, rising on the wind. There's no pretty way to ask how suffering can be pointless, no neat way to tuck away the unwaking years or dive into spots of blushing time. I'm simple, I told the frozen falcon, meaning I'm sedimentary rock eroding, piecemeal then and granular now. Silos glow golden in falling light, and cows linger at the hay trough's side, and the falcon left in the simplest way. Before I had a chance to ask if he was meant to teach me something, he had gone and the road seeped heat into the cooling sky. I thought, make me molten, rouge my knees with reddest clay. Thank you. And so this next one, as I've said, I grew up like in the city. So a lot of how I learned to enjoy nature was in the neighborhood, like in backyards and in urban parks. So this is sort of what that's about. It's called Midwest Storm. There is a day of rain that I remember fleetingly, bikes taken from the street so as not to become lightning rods. 5 p.m. and the flickering of street lamps into an orange sodium vapor glow, bare feet on rocky ground. A torrent of summer rain sliding down the sloping cul-de-sac, and we dipped our toes into curbside streams like urban rivers, danced, hollered over the rhythmic pounding of water, and never felt rain that warm again. And so this next one, I live in a dorm on the UMaine campus, and so I feel like one of the things about living in a dorm is that it's not always super easy to feel like you can necessarily like make the natural world part of your own like living environment. So this is about my roommates and I are plants on the windowsill. It's called Ecotone. Seedlings green and curling fresh in damp soil as windowsill ecotone, once and future interarboration as interconnection, as the ease of being so soft and wild as my hopes for you so heavy with dirt under fingernails as even roommate seedlings, tender wards. Here, love as noun, not act, merely a state of being as a lit full spectrum bulb in a Goodwill lamp. You as my simplest love, so intimate and unspoiled. And this is the last one. I do not have any good introduction for it, but it's called When the Mammoths Sleep. When hematite is filtered through sandstone cracks, it creates glitter quartz honeycomb, only iron ore left behind, red like dusk, light dapple filtered through leaves cascading across a slow-moving creek. That water that wears the sediment off mammoth bones and trilobites, coral, spines, and seashell imprints parade across public parking lot gravel. That's got glitter in it too if you've got a good eye. Flint in Ohio and rose quartz in West Virginia and Kentucky agate the color of brick, all below boot soles, trampled and trodden underfoot, like delicious wild onion in the grass meant to be chewed in hellish humidity for the taste of bitter grass and fibers that have to be wedged out with a toothpick. I've never believed honeysuckle has a honey taste like kids said, but every year I've sucked the flower buds for promised sugar, crossed my heart and hoped to die. I've pinky promised to try again next year when the hematite glitters and the mammoths sleep and the wild onions are strung between teeth like violin strings. Thank you.
What a gift you have with language. That was a real treat, Iris. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn it over to JP again to kick off our discussion and conversations.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you all. It was wonderful readings, just wonderful. I want to recreate that debate that we started by email with a short question. I want to say simple question. It's not simple. What is eco-poetry? And it's a little different than a Taoist tanka or a Zen haiku or Wordsworth romanticism. There's a different, at least quality, if not form. And I'm just interested in your personal perspectives about what eco-poetry is to you. Megan, you want to kick it off?
Sure. I mean, for me, eco-poetry is grieving the changing world, right? It's witnessing and giving voice to that witnessing. And I for me, it's how I process grief. I mean, I really feel like, I mean, I still am troubled, but writing this book, it was like something sort of was lifted from me in a way. And not responsibility, but just like taking some sort of action about what's happening. And also when my daughter is older and she says, Mom, like, how could you have let this happen? Right. I'll be like, here, like I cared. I care. And, so that's what it is. That's what eco-poetry is for me personally.
Awesome. I want to hear from the others before circling back around to 2 or 3 things in there. I think that's wonderful. Anybody? Iris, your thoughts?
Well, I will say, I feel like for me, it's really hard because I will admit I did some like reading like of academic articles on eco-poetry before this. So that way I could feel like I could come and not sound like stupid. And I think that one of the things that I struggle with a lot, like when looking at some of the more strict like definitions of eco-poetry, is I've seen some where it's like if you reference a human being in it at all, if you can tell that a human being is writing it, that's not eco-poetry. And I don't know, at least for me, it feels more like how we like craft our like relationship with the environment and how we reform it in productive ways, because I feel like we can't ever really like escape our own like experience of the world. We can't like unbecome human and stop being complicit in climate change. And so I feel like, at least for me, like that sense of eco-poetry, especially like looking at like collections of commonly accepted eco-poetry, is that the ones that feel most impactful to me are the ones that like both encourage relationships with nature and find new ways to explore them in productive ways.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. I have an ongoing project of just collecting all of the different definitions of poetry that I find from other poets and critics. And it's so diverse. I find it kind of wonderful that there isn't one definition and that there are many ways of entering into it. And I think the same can be said for eco-poetry as well. Kathleen, any thoughts to add here?
Oh, so many, but where to start?
Right.
The first poet I remember being referred to as an eco-poet was Gary Snyder. But the more I think about it, you can go all the way back to William Wordsworth, of all people, because certainly we think of him as a nature poet, and that nature is thematic or symbolic in his poetry. But he later in life, when he moved back to the Lake Country where he'd grown up, he got his neighbors very interested in facing up to the powers that be in his town and telling them that they did not want the steam engine coming through that territory. He was very, very opposed to industrialism coming to the countryside. And so he wrote this poem that was, what was it called? It's called On the Projected Kendall and Windermere Railway. And it sounds so 21st century almost, people. And so when I think of eco-poetry, I also think of people having something to say about something and not just being in awe of or wonder of the earth. I mean, we're beyond that now. It's there and it's always been there, but we have to go somewhere else with it. It isn't just beauty is truth, truth is beauty anymore. It's way, way, way beyond that. We're in rescue mode, but also we can't get to the point where we're talking on behalf of animals or on behalf of in a way that is taking away from what eco really means, which is family, which is interesting, household, family. And it was first, I think, came into being by a German scientist of some sort. And so that word eco, which comes from the Greek oikos, but you put that onto poetry and it has kind of a different meaning. The other day in my class, I asked my class who are not just English majors, but different majors and lots of STEM majors, science and technology. And I asked them to tell me what the difference was between ecology and environment, because I recall mostly thinking of myself as an environmental poet for the longest time in the 70s and 80s. And so they said, well, because we have a department, and many colleges have a department of environmental studies and ecology, what's the difference? And so they immediately said, well, ecology is the study of the science of the interrelationship between organic systems, and that the human isn't really part of that. Well, I thought that was really interesting. And then they said that the environmental studies has to do with human beings being involved in the necessity of looking out for, taking care of, understanding, revisioning what the systems are that we deal with that are outside of science, but that deal with the environment, and that eco-poetry is really a part of the larger scheme of environmental poetry. So it's been evolving and evolving and evolving, but I think that eco-poets are ones who have something to say about what everyone else has already said, but have something to say that investigates both formally, because quite often the form of their poems have a lot to do with what they're talking about. I'm thinking about, oh, what's her name? Never mind. But, oh, what is her name? The poet who is often now in the New Yorker and has written 2 books on eco-poetics, and has poems that often start on the other side of the margin and go out, or that move from very large to very small. And we recognize that as a kind of thinking that we do now that has to do with things falling apart and trying to bring them back, trying to support them. I don't know, I'm talking way too much, but yeah, so big difference between eco-poetics and environmental poetry, really. Yeah.
Gary, weigh in and feel just absolutely free to be as contrarian as you like. I know it's always colorful. I think you're muted.
Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
No, I've done poetry workshops with deaf poets, so I was just trying, it's beautiful. I think there are as many forms of poetry as there are human hearts. I hate boxes. I hate borders. I think I think in terms of watersheds and natural systems and not human borders. And for me, that term eco-poetics puts another box there for academics to talk about and write papers about it. And I know that I don't have a terminal degree. Instead of going to graduate school, I literally went and lived at Gary Snyder's house for a year as his apprentice, his poet's apprentice. And when I got hired to teach at Bates, they told me I wasn't qualified to teach beat poetry because I didn't have a terminal degree. And I pointed out that terminal was exactly what I thought it was, yeah. But it's wonderful to talk about a poetry, but for thousands of years, people have been writing poetry that comes out of their existence in the natural world. We can't, many of us these days deny that we exist as a part of the natural world. We're somehow something else of it. And I don't want to have a poetry that's something else of it, that's apart from rather than within. So I bristle, and it's, and then people get, oh, that's just Gary, which is fine, but I think every poem comes from the earth in some way. I think every creative act comes from being a part of this universe and the universe flowing through us. And I'm the wrong person to ask about ecopoetics. When I was living at Snyder's house, we talked a lot about being watershed poets or bioregional poets.
Hmm.
And that was just a reflection of what our poems were interested in at the time and what we were talking about at the time. And we got bioregional from Ray Dassman, who was not a poet, but it was a way that we were looking at the map and removing state and national lines. And you know, wouldn't it be nice to remove some state and national lines and maybe not have nationalist thinking, and you know, and have watershed thinking. And Kathleen's project about water is so wonderful because water doesn't adhere to boundaries. Migratory birds don't adhere to boundaries, you know, and yet we screw everything up. We create boundaries, we create dams for that water. We put toxins into that water. We take away the feeding stops for the migratory birds. They get to the place where they're supposed to have something to eat and it's not there anymore. Where did I go? It was an eco-poetic rant. All right, I'm going to stop.
Can I
Well, we're richer for it, so
add
thank you.
something there, John Paul? I
Please.
think that was wonderful, Gary, and it just adds so much to this conversation. And it made me think of, I had listened to a talk with Ellen Bass and Marie Howe about eco-poetry. And I think what Marie Howe was saying was the difference between that and nature poetry was in what we're calling eco-poetry now. We are not making a differentiation between ourselves and nature. It is seeing it as all interrelated. And I think that's part of what you were saying, this interrelationship of things. And we're just a part of that bigger picture. But I also wanted to just chime in. There's a comment in the chat about that I wanted to add here. I think that Ellen Goldsmith offered a description of eco-poetry that she said speaks to her and maybe to you too. Eco-poetry is nature poetry that has designs on us, imagines changing the ways we think, feel about, live, and act in the world.
Mm, mm. And I'm hoping that the character and shape of the world that eco-poetry evolves into is one of greater hope. You know, Meghan and I have definitely filtered a lot of grief and anxiety, and that's not the whole point. I loved Iris speaking to an urban experience and how nature was still there. And in fact, we are nature. We eat it, breathe it, drink it. We, you know, talk about escaping it. We can't escape it. Unless we go to that final frontier, perhaps. So I think speaking to that is pretty terrific. I think that we're at an extraordinary time now that we've labeled it, the geologists have labeled it the Anthropocene, a geologic era named after our species. We live in extraordinary times, and I think that fundamental shift in consciousness about our abilities as agents in nature is certainly reflected in most eco-poetry. I love one of the things Meghan said during our email exchanges. I think she said something to the effect of, well, it's pretty hard not to be an eco-poet these days. Almost everything in some ways touches on that. And I think that touches into the web of life, that ecology that also speaks to. Chime in if you like.
Well, speaking of hope, JP,
Yeah.
Somebody named Bundy Bolt wrote in the chat that a great new book to give all of us encouragement about the planet is The Book of Hope by Jane Goodall and Doug Abrams. He says, I highly recommend it. Jane is almost 90 and has a lot to say after years of activism.
Can we just talk here too? Hello, I'm Kathy Lyon. I'm sitting in from Canada.
Yes.
Yes, well, eco-poetry is often so very depressing. And as Meghan said, you are full of fear. And what am I going to tell my daughter? And when she comes and says, you didn't do enough. Let me tell you, when you live in Ottawa and you are struggling with minus 40 degrees in the winter, and with tons and tons and tons of snow every winter, you're beginning to wonder, where the hell is this global warming? Shouldn't we have a little warmer winters by now? But we are all very aware that the climate is changing. But here's the thing, 90,000 years ago, here in Ottawa, where we are, there was a shield of ice 1.6 kilometers thick. 90,000 years ago. And that's a blink of an eye, not even a blink of an eye in the history of the universe. Well, if we knew how old the universe were. And then there was global warming and the ice melted and we were in the Champlain Sea. And even now, for many, 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 many years, this was all a sea. We were at the bottom of the sea here. And terrible, terrible animals and fish, sharks, 10 or 20 times the size of today's sharks are there, and we still find teeth of these sharks everywhere because they had so many teeth and they lost them all the time. And when I'm at the cottage by the lake, I dig a foot and I'm on sand, and that was the bottom of the sea. And then global warming occurred again, and the Champlain Sea that went right down into the USA disappeared, and we are now on dry land. And then you look at this and you say, nature is so strong. Why don't we just start coping with it? You know, it's wonderful when our government, for example, has wonderful ideas and it has all kinds of activities planned. But what we're not planning is how we are measuring the results of these activities. And when we don't know where we are heading, people are not interested because they're not sure that whatever we are planning to do has any effect at all on the and that's what we have to, I think, approach this, even in eco-poetry, with more happiness that we are alive and that we have a wonderful continent. And whatever happens to this continent, I think one thing is for sure, it will right itself, because nature is so very, very strong that we human beings, I often think, can really contribute very little to healing it, whatever. By all means, tidy up what we are messing up, by all means. But that we can change climate significantly, that we would need to have specific activities and measurable activities and measurable results year after year, and 10 years, in 100 years. If we do this, what will happen and how can we prove it? But in the meantime, I think we should not, our children are very worried because all we tell them, it's too late, the world will disappear and the world will be a terrible place and we will not be able to live in it and whatnot. And I think that's not going to happen, not in our lifetime and not in many, 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 many lifetimes. I know this year when the Nobel Prize for Physics, or 2 years ago, when the Nobel Prize for Physics went to astrophysicists, and they came back and they said what they have discovered is, contrary to what Voyager says, that we had 136 similar celestial systems as the Earth has, there were in fact millions of them out there. And we are a tiny speck here, and we have a tiny, wonderful planet. And as they said, when they were given the Nobel Prize, within 30 years, we will probably have the tools to detect activities of perhaps not human beings, but of other creatures in the world, in the universe, and that we will be able to find out who they are and where they are. I think for us to fear what is going to happen is, you know, we have only one life. Let's live it happily as we can, and by all means, let's tidy things up, but don't fill our children with fear and loathing and unhappiness. Anyway, I think I've talked a lot.
Thank you so much. And I noticed that Iris's hand is up here. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, Sorry, it muted again. So I'm not a scientist, you know, I am an English major. I do not think that I have the qualifications to comment on the science of whether or not this is like a big deal in the grand scheme of like the changing climate throughout the history of like the world. But I think that at least for me, it's not just about like climate change. I worked at a Girl Scout camp when I was in high school, and the Girl Scouts have a program called Camp for Every Girl to get inner city girls to come to camp to like experience nature. And I don't know, I've worked with a lot of girls who had never seen like more than 1 or 2 stars before. I've worked with girls who were incredibly afraid of mud and had a very hard time walking across grass, who had never slept in a tent before, who had never slept outside before, and just like viewing like how poor like their relationship with the environment was and how little they could understand it. I don't know, that was very like difficult for me because I grew up in a family that like, you know, like where the idea of a vacation is like, you know, you camp in a tent. Like that was like, you know, that's just what you did. But to watch those girls like relationships with nature develop over that 1 week and to see how that changed just how they interacted with the group and with the counselors, I thought was so fascinating. Like these girls who needed to have their hand held when we walked down trails after it rained just to get to the dining hall, like, you know, who were just like so fine by the end of the week. And I feel like one of the things that I really love about eco poetry, like as someone like who usually does like live in like an urban environment, who maybe like, you know, like the best I can do sometimes is like to find a public park where I just kind of hope eventually I won't be able to hear cars wherever I am in the woods. I think it's a tool for building relationships with the environment, because the problem isn't just that like everyone might die. I feel like it's also what we lose when we lose that relationship with nature. But then on the activist front, I feel like you also can't, you don't really want to protect what you don't care for. And so I think that encouraging that like care and that like attention to detail like through poetry is like effective activist work, in that it builds the relationship that activism is founded upon. So I don't know, that would just be my response. I agree that like joy is obviously very important. I like to write about joy in nature a lot, but I think that part of the joy is about countering what happens without it.
Mhm.
Very nice.
Beautifully said.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think also poetry privileges emotion, and part of what poetry explores is how we feel. And I think these feelings that Meghan is having as a young parent, I've shared them. You know, 10 or 15 years ahead. You know, my daughter's a little bit older. But I remember being a kid in the Everglades watching it change. You know, the clouds of flamingos disappeared, and thinking as a young person, my child will not be able to see this. I'm seeing something my child won't be able to see. And as I look back at that, I think, you know, that's an unusual perspective to have, that in the face of that. And so I don't want to turn this into a scientific debate or a climate debate. And as you mentioned, the Anthropocene is quite a bit more than that. It's also the 6th, 8th great age of extinction. It's also measured by the thin layer of plastic that coats the earth and the heavy metals with it. It's far more than climate change. But I think what we're speaking about here is, what does it feel like? How is it, both emotionally, also what is it like to think, and also what is it like to move our bodies in this natural environment? And we're addressing that through our poetry. One of the things that I've turned to language for is just looking at the way that we describe nature. It's out there. I've been lamenting that we don't have a word for we as being part of nature, that somehow that the very way that we use language often distances us from what we think of as the natural environment when we are it. It's kind of strange to be able to say, you know, when we are we. But maybe there's another word we can look for, or maybe it would be understood when we say things like that. So the language, I think, is very important as we develop new perspectives and develop new concepts.
I think Alan Goldsmith has put a couple of comments in the chat maybe Ellen, you want to speak to them?
Okay, briefly, I like what you said about the failure of language, and I'm just wondering if we look to native poets, if there'd be better words. I don't know the answer to that, but possibly it's something I'm interested in looking into. In response to a previous comment, I'm just thinking about how poems are so nuanced and have different layers. And there can be layers of grief and loss, but also appreciation and love and beauty. And I think to echo some things that a number of people said, but particularly you, Iris, that they're not prescriptions, but that they create awareness, which can change behavior, which can be important.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you. That's great. And to your response, yes, there are indigenous languages that describe all kinds of relationships, and some of those are poets, and it's been wonderful to read some of those. Quickly, a Navajo friend of mine was trying to translate something. I asked him, so Ben, when you're thinking about being a part of land, how do you describe it? He says, well, on our res, we often describe each other as, oh, you're of that place. You're not from that place. You're of that place, the place near the river. And that's interesting. So his using English reshaped it for me. And I thought that was a wonderful way of looking at it. So yes, I very much think the indigenous cultures have a great deal to offer us.
Kathleen?
Yeah. Since I missed a few minutes at the beginning, I'm not sure whether you talked about other questions that were brought up. So I'll ask my question that I gave to you over the email.
Excellent.
And that was, so Adrienne Rich was very interested in how she could be useful, what she had to say, what she had to write. And of course, with her prose pieces and her essays as well. But in poetry, she wanted to write so that she had something useful to say. And of course, she talked about transformation and about change, more often than not about women's liberation and lesbian and poems that had to do with opening up and becoming who you are as a woman, because it was important at the time in the 70s and 80s. But also she then went into much broader areas and responded to the wars that were going on, not only the Vietnam and the wars in the deserts, and she lived until 2012, so she was very active as a political writer. And she thought that poetry can make change. So I wanted to know whether you thought of your work in that way, the people who spoke today, and also it was such a beautiful reading by everybody. And it was great to hear Iris read. I'd never really heard her read all of her poems before like that. It's beautiful. But do you have any kind of urge or intimation when you're reading that you're writing not just for yourself or a group of poets or maybe for a muse or somebody, but that you are trying to do something useful to make change in some way, which Ellen was just talking about. So I wondered if we could maybe ask some of the, Megan, I don't know, what do you think?
I mean, I love the idea of sparking change, but I wouldn't say that's my motivation. Like what I write for myself, and what happens to someone who reads it, whether they're inspired or moved, or, the poems that I'm writing about climate give some people sort of maybe a moment of pause because it's not something that they are themselves concerned about. I can't say how it's going to be interpreted or used, but I write it because it's my obsession And I write it because it's how I try to understand what's happening. And, you know, we have family friends that are not maybe politically aligned with me who have purchased my book. And, you know, do they read them and think like, wow, I should not vote for those Nazis? I don't know, but is that it's not even a secret hope. I can't say what effect my poems will have. I can only say what the effect is on myself and my own behavior and my own actions. And when you're obsessively writing poems about the environment and changes and dwindling snowfall and things like that, when you're living in Maine, it does create a ripple effect in my own life. And that's as much as I can hope for. So that's my answer.
John Paul, would you like to kind of have the last word here? Because we're getting to 5:30 and I hate to even cut this conversation off because it's so fascinating to me, but.
You mean a last word as in thanking everybody for coming, or?
No, last word on this subject. I'll thank people for coming. I'll take that last word back.
Okay, thank you. I sometimes worry about quoting the source on this because it can be divisive, but I think Hillary Clinton said something very wise quite a while ago. She's a sharp lady. Said if you want to affect change, you first have to change the way that people feel about things. And as I've seen the whole climate, when I say the environmental movement, I did an interesting presentation. Ellen was there, shepherded that through the Farnsworth. It's up on the website. I've seen this back and forth with rational arguments, trading facts and data. And I kind of will tell my story about re-entering into poetry. It was inspired when I went to Al Gore's Climate Reality Leadership Corps down in Atlanta. And after Al Gore gave us the demonstration of how to do his Truth in 10 lecture, which was full of data, and it was very well presented, also inflected by Reverend Barber. He had this new burr in his language. He was preaching a little bit. It was pretty neat. The climate justice movement was there in force, as was the youth movement. And they played this little video of this young girl reciting one of her poems. And it just affected me so strongly. Okay, there's Al. He's great. Love him. Love what he's done and what he's trying to do to empower other people to make their own contributions. But this young girl with her simple poem just got me. And I said, you know, I don't need to be the grassroots activist. I'm not that good at that, but I am an artist and this needs to be part of my life. I was talking to my friend that I made during that conference, a filmmaker, and it was last December. And I said, you remember that girl with that poem? I said, yeah, man, that was Amanda Gorman. It's like, okay, so Greta was tuning in with the youth movement and there was Amanda representing. I didn't know who Amanda was at that point, you know, but she touched me deeply. And I hope that art can prepare the ground for change and empower us with perspective that can forward emotions and ways of being that are really significant to us. I don't see it as, it's not legislation. It's a strange form of action, but communication, to speak and to be listened to, is a very powerful act. And when you're speaking deep truths in compelling ways, I think it can be even more powerful. And I think if only one person heard our poems, but it created that ripple that made a difference, it does make a difference. I have hope and faith that it does.
Thank you. Thank you. So beautifully said. And I just want to thank all of our poets today. You have moved me, you have inspired me, you've enlightened me. And I think for so many of our participants today, that's been true too. And John Paul and I were talking, we had so many people who wanted to read today. who weren't part of our event, that we may have another event sometime later, maybe even next year, where we have more of an open call and we can continue this conversation. Because it's a note that really resonates and reverberates for all of us in different ways. And these different perspectives have been so helpful. So thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And see you again.